The iron wheels chanted a monotonous prayer against the steel tracks, a rhythm of relentless forward motion that had no concern for the sun-scorched land it bisected. New Mexico, 1875. The world outside the grimy window was a canvas of ochre, rust, and bleached bone, a vast, indifferent emptiness that stretched to a horizon shimmering with heat. Dust, fine as ground meal, seeped through every crack and seam of the carriage, coating the worn velvet of the seats, the brass fittings, and the weary souls rattling along inside. It was a train of ghosts, or people on their way to becoming them. Prospectors with hands raw and hopes bled dry. Families chasing rumors of fertile land that likely existed only in pamphlets. And solitary figures who carried their pasts in the set of their shoulders. They were all running from something or to something. And in the hypnotic clatter of the wheels, the two destinations often blurred into one. In the last car, where the sway was most pronounced and the coal smoke thickest, sat Calder Reeve. He occupied the bench alone, not through any overt act of hostility, but through an aura of stillness that discouraged company. He was a man who seemed to take up no more space than his physical form required, yet the air around him felt dense, claimed. His back was to the solid wall of the carriage. His long legs stretched out just enough to be comfortable, but not to impede the aisle. It was a position of rest, but also of vigilance. A habit etched into him by years that had demanded he know what was happening in front of him at all times. His face was a map of the lands he'd traversed. The sun had tanned his skin to the color of worn leather and carved fine lines around his eyes. Eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky. They missed nothing. He watched the shimmer of heat twist the shape of a distant butte, noted the flight of a hawk circling on a thermal, and registered the subtle shift in weight as a passenger 2 rows up finally slumped into an exhausted sleep. He was a former Army scout, a man who had once read stories in broken twigs and overturned stones. Now, he mostly read the silence in empty spaces, including the one that resided within himself. The war, the tracking, the living on the edge of a knife, it had all scraped something out of him, leaving behind a quiet that was heavier than any noise. He wore a plain cotton shirt, gray with dust, and canvas trousers tucked into scuffed boots. Over it all was a long duster of dark, oiled leather, a garment that was both a shield and a shroud. It smelled of horse, wood smoke, and the faint, metallic tang of rain on dry earth. His hat, a wide-brimmed Stetson, rested low on his brow, casting his face in permanent shadow. A gun belt was cinched at his hips, the walnut grip of his Colt a familiar weight against his thigh. He was not a gunslinger. Not anymore. He was just a man who understood that in this part of the world. Peace was often a negotiation conducted at a distance, and the pistol was a tool for setting terms. The other passengers in the car gave him a wide berth. They saw the calm, the self-containment, and mistook it for menace. They didn't see the deep, abiding weariness that settled in his bones, a fatigue that came not from a lack of sleep, but from a surplus of seeing. He was heading north, towards Colorado. Though his reasons were vague even to himself, he was just moving. It was what he knew how to do. When the world behind you offered nothing, and the world ahead offered no promises, you simply kept moving. The afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the desert in hues of orange and deep purple. The light slanted through the window, illuminating the swirling motes of dust in the carriage, making them dance like tiny, frantic spirits. The rhythm of the train was a lullaby of iron and steam, and a heavy quiet had fallen over the passengers. It was into this sleepy, suspended moment that she appeared. She came through the connecting door from the next car, a frantic whisper of movement that snagged the attention of every half-open eye. She wasn't just walking, she was fleeing. The door swung shut behind her with a thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. She stood there for a second, framed in the narrow aisle, a wild, cornered thing. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with a face that might have been pretty under different circumstances. Right now, it was smudged with dirt and pale with terror. Her dress, a simple calico of faded blue, was torn at the shoulder, and the hem was caked with mud, as if she had been running through marshy ground, though there was nothing but sand for 100 miles in any direction. Her hair, the color of dark honey, had escaped its pins and fell in tangled wisps around her face. But it was her eyes that held Calder's gaze. They were wide and the color of moss, and they were utterly, nakedly terrified. They darted around the carriage, scanning the faces of the sleeping passengers, the empty seats, the windows that showed nothing but the blur of the passing landscape. She was a bird trapped in a box, searching for a crack of light, a way out. Her breath came in shallow, hitched gasps. Her gaze swept past Calder once, then snapped back, snagging on the shadow and stillness he projected. Maybe she saw the danger in him and thought it could cancel out the danger behind her. Or maybe she saw the emptiness and thought he was the only one who wouldn't ask questions, the only one who wouldn't care enough to get involved or turn her in. Her feet, clumsy and worn-out shoes, took a hesitant step toward him, then another. She stopped beside his bench, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt into a knot. She smelled of dust, sweat, and a fear so potent it was almost a physical presence in the air. He didn't move, didn't even shift his gaze from the window, though his attention was now entirely on her. He could feel the desperate energy radiating from her, a frantic vibration against his own profound calm. "Mister," she whispered, her voice so thin and frayed it was barely more than a breath of sound. "Please." Calder remained silent. He gave no sign that he had heard her, but his stillness was now an act of listening. He waited. In his experience, trouble often came wrapped in a plea. She swallowed hard, a dry, clicking sound in her throat. "I need to hide," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush, desperate and raw. "Just for a few hours, until the next stop. They're looking for me." He finally turned his head, his movements slow and deliberate. He let his gaze drift over her, taking in the torn dress, the frantic pulse beating in the hollow of her throat, the way she flinched as if expecting a blow. He saw no weapon, no malice. He saw only a rabbit with the hounds on its scent. His eyes met hers, and for a long moment, the world shrank to the space between them. Her moss-green eyes were a well of primal fear, but beneath it, there was a flicker of something else, a desperate, defiant will to survive. It was a look he recognized. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers pinned down by enemy fire, and he had seen it in the reflection of his own face in a muddy puddle a lifetime ago. "I've got nowhere else," she added, the last of her composure crumbling, her voice cracking on the final word. Calder said nothing. Words were liabilities. They could be twisted, repeated, used against you. Actions were cleaner. He thought of the trouble she would bring, of the men who were likely looking for her, of the dozen reasons he should tell her to move on, to find another car, another savior. He had spent years extricating himself from the affairs of others, building a wall of solitude around himself. But then he saw the faint, purplish mark just visible on her wrist where her sleeve had ridden up, the shadow of a bruise in the shape of fingers. It was an old story, written on the skin, and he was tired, so deeply tired, but perhaps not yet so dead inside that he could watch the hounds tear the rabbit apart. He didn't nod. He didn't offer a single word of comfort or consent. His expression remained unchanged, a mask of stoic indifference, but with a slow, almost imperceptible movement. He lifted his left hand and took hold of the edge of his leather duster. He raised it just enough to create a dark, protected space between his body and the heavy coat. It was an invitation, a silent, non-committal offer of sanctuary. The girl's eyes widened, first in confusion, then in a sudden, dawning wave of desperate gratitude. She didn't hesitate. There was no time for thanks, no room for second thoughts. She dropped to her knees on the dusty floorboards, the movement quick and fluid as a shadow. She scrambled forward and slid into the space he had made, curling herself into a tight ball against the hard wall of the carriage. Calder let the heavy leather fall, covering her completely. The duster settled with a soft sigh, creating a new landscape on the bench, a mound of dark material that betrayed nothing of the secret it now held. To anyone looking, he was simply a man resting under his coat. Beneath the thick, oiled leather, he could feel the slight, trembling warmth of her body. He could feel the frantic, muffled rhythm of her breathing against his side. She was utterly still, trying to make herself small, to erase her own existence from the world. The scent of her fear was now contained, mingling with the familiar smells of his own life. He turned his head back to the window. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first pale stars were beginning to appear in the vast, darkening sky. The desert was surrendering to the cool of the night. The train rattled on, its wheels chanting their endless, indifferent rhythm. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. A dusty secret was now curled up beside him, breathing in the dark, and Calder Reeve was no longer entirely alone. Beneath the heavy drape of the duster, the world was reduced to darkness, sound, and sensation. Nora curled herself into the smallest possible shape, pressing her back against the vibrating wall of the train car. The darkness was absolute, smelling of oiled leather, trail dust, and the faint, clean scent of the man beside her. She could hear the rhythmic clatter of the wheels, a sound that had been the backdrop to her terror for the last day. But now it was muffled, distant. "Closer, more immediate," was the sound of Calder's breathing, a slow, steady cadence that was the antithesis of the frantic hammering in her own chest. She held her own breath, praying for invisibility, for the ability to melt into the floorboards. Every tremor of the car was a jolt to her frayed nerves. She was certain that at any moment the coat would be ripped away, and she would be found. The face of Silas Croft swam in the darkness of her mind, a man with a face like a clenched fist and eyes like chips of slate. He was a land baron, a man who owned the border station and everything in it, including, he believed, the people. He had looked at her not as a person, but as a deed to be signed, a property to be acquired. Her guardian, a distant cousin who had taken her in after her father's death, had made the arrangement without a word to her. A fine match. He'd called it security. Nora had looked into Croft's eyes and seen not security, but a cage made of bone. So she had run. She had slipped out of the station house with nothing but the clothes she wore and a desperate prayer, scrambling onto the slow-moving freight train as it pulled away in the pre-dawn gloom. A tremor ran through her, a violent, uncontrollable shiver born of fear and exhaustion. Beside her, she felt Calder shift slightly, the solid wall of his thigh a point of anchor in her swirling panic. He didn't speak, didn't move to comfort her. He simply existed, a bulwark of quiet against the storm inside her. The absence of questions was its own kind of mercy. He had seen her, and he had hidden her. And for now, that was enough. It was more than anyone else had offered. Calder felt the girl's trembling. It was a fine, constant vibration, like that of a wire pulled too taut. He kept his eyes fixed on the darkening landscape outside. His posture relaxed, betraying none of the tension her presence created. He was a man accustomed to solitude, the proximity of another human, especially one radiating such potent fear, was a foreign intrusion. It was like holding a frightened bird in your hand. You felt its frantic heartbeat against your palm, and your own body instinctively tensed, caught between the urge to soothe and the desire to let it go. He had registered the bruise on her wrist, not as a story, but as a fact. It was a piece of information, like the direction of the wind or the tracks of a coyote. It told him she was not running from the law. The law didn't leave marks like that. Men did. He didn't need the details. The details were her own. All he needed to know was that the danger she was fleeing was real enough to make her trust her life to the shadows of a stranger's coat. The train began to slow, its rhythm changing from a steady chant to a long, groaning complaint of steel on steel. The lights of a small depot town glittered weakly in the distance, This was a scheduled stop, a place to take on water and unload what little freight was destined for such a forgotten corner of the territory. It was also a place where men looking for someone could easily board. Calder's senses sharpened. He didn't move a muscle, but his awareness spread through the carriage, listening. The train hissed to a stop. The familiar sounds of the car, the snores of a sleeping merchant, the rustle of a newspaper were now overlaid with the noises from the platform, muffled shouts, the clank of metal, the heavy tread of boots on the wooden planks. The connecting door at the far end of the car slammed open. 3 men entered, and the atmosphere in the carriage immediately curdled. They did not belong here among the weary travelers. They moved with a swaggering purpose, their eyes sweeping the car with predatory intent. 2 were broad-shouldered men with the dull, brutish look of hired muscle. The third, who seemed to be their leader, was leaner, with a nervous energy and weasel-like eyes that darted everywhere. He wore a dusty bowler hat and a waistcoat that was too tight for him. "All right, folks, just a routine check," the leader announced, his voice thin but loud. "Looking for a runaway. Young woman. Answers to Nora. Got a purse of $10 for anyone with information?" A murmur went through the passengers. Sleepy eyes opened. Heads lifted. No one spoke. $10 was a good sum, but siding with men like these was a risky investment. Under the coat, Nora went rigid. Her breath hitched in her throat, and she pressed her face into the rough canvas of Calder's trousers, her body shaking so hard he could feel it in his bones. He laid a hand flat on the duster, a slight, steadying pressure. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a command, be still. The men started down the aisle, their boots thudding on the floorboards. They were clumsy in their search, nudging sleeping passengers, peering rudely into faces. Their presence was an offense, a violation of the unspoken truce of weary travelers. The weasel-eyed man did the talking while the other 2 provided a backdrop of silent menace. They moved closer, row by row. Calder did not turn to look at them. He remained as he was, a still figure staring out the window at the flickering lanterns of the depot. He could feel the men's approach, could sense their gaze falling on his solitary form. The space around him, which had once felt empty, was now the most conspicuous place in the entire car. "Evening, friend." The leader's voice was suddenly right beside him, slick with false congeniality. Calder slowly turned his head. He didn't look up at the man's face. He lifted his gaze just enough to meet the man's eyes. He said nothing. His eyes were what did it. They were not angry, not challenging, not fearful. They were flat, calm, and utterly empty of anything the man could use. It was like looking into the cold, clear water of a deep well and seeing no bottom. There was a history in that gaze, a knowledge of violence and survival that the cheap bravado of the man with the bowler hat could not begin to comprehend. Calder's stare didn't threaten. It simply stated a fact. It said, "I see you, and I am the end of this road." The weasel-eyed man faltered. The easy confidence drained from his face, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He looked at the quiet man on the bench, at the worn gun belt, at the formidable stillness that seemed to suck the air right out of his lungs. He looked at his 2 bruisers, who had also stopped, suddenly hesitant. They were paid to be tough, but they were not paid to die over a runaway girl in a forgotten town. "See anyone unusual tonight?" the man asked, his voice losing some of its bluster. Calder held his gaze for a second longer, then gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He turned his attention back to the window, a clear, final dismissal. The moment stretched, thick with unspoken tension. The leader licked his dry lips. He could push, he could demand to look under the coat. But something in the sheer, unyielding presence of the man before him warned him it would be the last mistake he ever made. He took a half-step back. "Right then," he muttered to his men. "Nothing here. Let's check the next car." They moved on, their heavy footsteps receding down the aisle. A collective, Silent sigh of relief seemed to pass through the carriage. Beneath the coat, Nora began to breathe again, her quiet sobs muffled by the thick leather. The train gave a lurch, then another, and with a great hiss of steam, it began to pull away from the station, leaving the 3 men and their $10 purse behind. But Calder knew they weren't safe. The men would get word to the next station. They would be waiting. The train was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap, moving them inexorably towards capture. He waited until the train had picked up speed, the wheels finding their familiar, hypnotic rhythm once more. The lights of the depot had vanished, plunging the world outside into a profound, moonless dark. He leaned down, his mouth close to the duster. "We're getting off," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. He felt her stiffen. He didn't wait for an answer. He shifted, pulling her with him until she was crouched on the floor at his feet. Still hidden, with his free hand, he reached over and unlatched the carriage window, pushing it down. The roar of the wind and the clatter of the wheels filled the car. He scanned the darkness outside. It was a risk, a high one. The ground was uneven, and the train was moving fast. But it was a better chance than the one waiting for them in the next town. He put his hand on her shoulder, giving it a firm squeeze. "On my count. You jump when I do, roll when you land." Her terror was a palpable thing, a living current that flowed into him through his hand. But she gave a short, jerky nod against his leg. "3, he said, his voice calm and clear over the noise. He rose to a low crouch, pulling her up with him. 2. He looked out into the rushing darkness one last time. 1. He didn't hesitate. He swung one leg out the window and launched himself into the night, pulling her with him. For a heart-stopping second, they were airborne, suspended between the moving train and the unforgiving earth. Then they hit. The impact was a brutal, jarring shock that knocked the wind from their lungs. They tumbled through sagebrush and loose rock, a tangle of limbs and coats. Calder's scout training took over, his body instinctively knowing how to absorb the fall, how to roll to dissipate the momentum. He held on to her, shielding her as best he could with his own body. They finally came to a stop in a cloud of dust, lying bruised and breathless as the red lights of the train receded into the darkness, its lonely sound fading until it was gone completely. Silence descended. A vast, profound silence broken only by the whisper of the night wind and their own ragged gasps for air. The sky above was a spray of cold, brilliant stars, more than Nora had ever seen. The air was crisp and cool, smelling of dust and wild sage. They were alive, they were free, and they were utterly, completely alone. Calder pushed himself to his knees, his body aching. He looked at Nora. She was sitting up, her arms wrapped around her legs, her face pale in the starlight. She looked small and fragile against the immense, dark landscape. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. She shook her head, though he knew she must be as bruised as he was. He stood up, pulling his duster around him. "We need shelter." He scanned the horizon, his eyes adjusting to the dark. He was looking for a shape, a line that wasn't natural, something to break the smooth, rolling contour of the land. His scout's instincts, long dormant, were now fully awake. After walking for what felt like an hour, his eyes caught a faint, angular silhouette against the star-dusted sky. A shack. They stumbled towards it, their bodies screaming with every step. It was an old homesteader's cabin, long since abandoned. The roof sagged, and the door hung crooked on a single leather hinge. But it was 4 walls and a roof, a defense against the wind and whatever else the night held. He pushed the door open. It groaned in protest. The inside was dark and smelled of decay, dust, and the ghosts of old fires. Moonlight streamed through a hole in the roof, illuminating a single room. It was empty save for a rusted, pot-bellied stove and a rickety table. It was a ruin, a monument to a forgotten dream. As his eyes adjusted, he saw something else, On a high shelf, covered in a thick blanket of dust, sat a bottle. It was dark glass, corked and sealed. Whiskey, left behind by the last person who had called this desolate place home. Nora came to stand beside him in the center of the derelict room. She looked around at the emptiness, at the moonlight painting stripes on the dusty floor. Her ordeal was over, but a new one was just beginning. She had escaped a cage only to find herself in a vast, open wilderness with a silent stranger. He reached up, his fingers closing around the neck of the dusty bottle. He pulled it down, wiping it on his sleeve. He held it up in the moonlight. Their entire inventory for this new life: 1 bottle of whiskey, 2 worn-out coats, and the heavy, unspoken weight of their shared breath in the cold, silent air. The silence inside the shack was a physical thing, as solid and as old as the dust that coated every surface. Outside, the wind whispered a lonesome song across the plains. But in here, the world had shrunk to the space of this one small, dilapidated room. Moonlight, filtered through a gaping hole in the roof, laid a pale, ghostly hand on the warped floorboards. It was a shelter of last resort, a place where things came to be forgotten. Nora remained huddled by the door, her own duster pulled tight around her as if its thin fabric could ward off the immensity of the night. The adrenaline from their escape had drained away, leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion. Every muscle ached from the fall, and her mind felt scoured raw. She watched Calder move through the shadows, his presence a dark, steady anchor in the disorienting quiet. He was not a man who wasted motion. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy that spoke of a life lived in hard places. He ran a hand along the chinking between the logs, testing for drafts. He kicked at the base of the pot-bellied stove, a dull thud of boot against rusted iron, checking its stability. He was assessing their fortress, mapping its weaknesses. In a corner, his searching hands found what he was looking for: a small pile of desiccated branches and dried brush, left behind by the last soul to seek refuge here, a final act of charity for the next traveler. He carried the kindling to the stove, opened its squealing iron door, and began to build a fire with the patient, practiced hands of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He didn't ask for help. He didn't seem to require it. Nora watched the small sparks from his flint and steel catch, glow, and finally blossom into a tiny, hungry flame. The fire was a living thing in the dead room. It crackled softly, a sound of comfort and defiance. It pushed back the oppressive dark, painting the interior of the shack in flickering shades of orange and gold. It was a small circle of warmth in a universe of cold, and Nora found herself inching closer, drawn to it like a moth. Calder sat on the floor, his back against the wall next to the stove, his long legs stretched out before him. The firelight carved deep shadows into the rugged landscape of his face, making him look older, harder, like a figure carved from weathered rock. He had uncorked the whiskey bottle and set it on the floor between them, just inside the ring of firelight. It sat there, dark and potent, the glass reflecting the dancing flames. It was not an invitation, not exactly. It was a fact, an option laid bare. Nora's eyes were fixed on the bottle. She knew its contents well. The immediate, burning relief it offered, the blessed numbness that could dull the edges of fear, that could muffle the sound of your own frantic thoughts. Since she'd been forced from her home, since the arrangements with Silas Croft had begun to close in around her, the cheap whiskey in the border station saloon had been her only friend. It was the armor she wore to get through the nights, the potion that allowed her to sleep without dreaming of his grasping hands and slate-chip eyes. To be awake, to be truly present in her own skin, had become an unbearable state. Her hand trembled as she reached for the bottle, her fingers, smudged with dirt and scraped from their fall, wrapped around the cool glass. The weight of it was familiar, a promise of oblivion. She could drink, and for a few hours, the shaking would stop. The shack wouldn't feel so fragile, and the man sitting in silence beside her wouldn't seem so unknowable. She could drink until she could finally fall into the dreamless blackness of sleep. It was all she had wanted for days. She lifted the bottle, her thumb stroking the dusty glass. But she didn't drink. She looked at Calder, who was staring into the flames, seemingly oblivious to her struggle. Yet she felt his awareness of her every move, as keen as a hawk's. He wasn't watching her, but he was seeing her. And, in that moment, she realized that to drink now would be a betrayal of the night's survival. It would mean erasing the terror. Yes, but it would also mean erasing the desperate courage of her escape. The heart-stopping leap into the dark, and the silent, profound act of this stranger who had offered her the shelter of his coat. It would mean choosing to forget the first time in a long time that she had not been entirely alone in her fear. With a long, shuddering breath, she placed the bottle back on the floor, untouched. Calder's voice, when it finally came, was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Being sober means you remember." He hadn't looked at her, his gaze still fixed on the fire. It wasn't an accusation or a judgment. It was a simple statement of truth, offered up to the space between them. He paused, then added, "If you don't want to forget." The words hung in the warm air. "If you don't want to forget." He was giving her a choice. Not about the whiskey, but about the memory itself. Did she want to remember this night? Did she want to own it, with all its fear and pain? Or let it dissolve into a hazy, alcoholic blur like all the nights that had come before? The shaking started again, a deep tremor that began in her core and radiated out to her fingertips. It wasn't from the cold. It was from the terrifying clarity of being sober, of feeling everything without a shield. She pulled her knees to her chest and slowly, hesitantly, edged closer to the fire, sitting a few feet away from him. The warmth from the stove felt good on her chilled skin. She started, her voice a reedy whisper that was nearly lost in the crackle of the flames. She cleared her throat and tried again, the words scraping their way out. "I've never done this. Sober." She wasn't looking at him, but at the hypnotic dance of the fire. She felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. It was a raw, humiliating confession. Never accepted help sober. Never sat in the quiet company of another person sober. Never faced the terror of a long night sober. This was everything. It was the simple, terrifying act of being present in her own life. Calder was silent for a long moment. Nora braced herself for a question, for a look of pity or disgust. She received neither. When she dared to glance at him, she saw him give a slow, deliberate nod, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of understanding. Perhaps he had heard her, and he had accepted her words without judgment. Then he moved. He leaned forward, his large frame uncoiling with a fluid grace, and picked up the whiskey bottle. Nora's heart gave a painful thud. She thought he would offer it to her again, or perhaps drink it himself, creating a different kind of distance between them. Instead, he reached for the small iron latch on the stove door. He pulled it open, revealing the fiery, beating heart of the fire within. Without a word, without any ceremony at all, he tipped the bottle and poured the entire contents directly onto the burning logs. The effect was instantaneous and violent. With a great roaring whoosh, the whiskey ignited. A column of blue and orange flame erupted inside the stove, so bright and so sudden that it lit up the entire shack like a flash of lightning. For a single, breathless second, every dark corner was banished, every line of dust and decay thrown into sharp, stark relief. The light illuminated Nora's face, her eyes wide with shock and awe, and it caught the hard, resolute lines of Calder's profile. The flare was hot and clean, a purifying blast that consumed the spirit that had offered her so much false comfort, turning it into nothing but light and heat. The fire roared for a moment longer, a hungry, beautiful beast, before it subsided as quickly as it had come, settling back into a steady, golden glow. The shack returned to its dance of shadow and flickering light. But the air felt different, cleaner. The heavy silence had been broken by the fire, and what returned was something softer, less freighted with the past. Calder closed the stove door, the click of the latch sounding unnaturally loud in the new quiet. He settled back against the wall. He laid his own heavy duster out on the floorboards, a barrier against the cold ground, then looked at her. His voice, when he spoke, was a near whisper, so low she had to strain to hear it over the gentle crackling of the logs. "Then let's remember," he said, his gaze direct and steady. "The first time you were touched gently, without fear." As he spoke, he reached out, but not for her. His hand went to the edge of his duster that he had laid out, and with a simple, practical gesture, he pulled it a little closer to where she sat, making sure a part of it was near enough to offer her its warmth and protection from the cold floor. The touch was not on her skin, but it was for her. It was a touch of provision, of care without claim. An act of simple, quiet grace in a ruined shack in the middle of nowhere. Nora stared at the offered warmth of the coat, then at the man who had given it. A single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek, glittering in the firelight before it fell. For the first time in a very long time, she felt the fragile, unfamiliar possibility of safety, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was a night she would never, ever want to forget. Sleep did not release Nora from the world. It gently lowered her into a quiet, dreamless depth she had not known for years. There was no jarring lurch into consciousness, no heart-pounding panic in a strange room. She drifted awake slowly, like a swimmer rising toward a surface of soft, gray light. The first thing she registered was the smell. It was clean and sharp, the scent of burning juniper and piñón pine, a fragrance that spoke of warmth and the wild, open earth. It was a stark contrast to the stale odors of whiskey and unwashed bodies that had been the backdrop of her life for so long. The second thing she noticed was the sound, a low, persistent murmur. The voice of the wind as it moved around the corners of the shack. It was not the threatening howl of the night before, but a gentler sound, a sigh of contentment from the vast, empty land, and beneath it, the soft, rhythmic crackle of a fire, steady and reassuring. She was warm, a deep, penetrating warmth that had seeped into her bones and chased away the last of the night's chill. She was lying on her side, cocooned in her own thin duster, but the warmth was radiating from the nearby stove. He must have fed the fire through the night while she slept, a silent, sleepless guardian. She remembered the fire flaring up, the astonishing heat of it, and his low voice making a promise. She had fallen asleep to the sound of the flames settling, feeling, for the first time in an age, something that resembled peace. Her body was a constellation of aches. Her shoulder, her hip, her knees, they all sang with the dull, thrumming pain of their hard landing. But it was a clean pain, a physical reminder that she was alive and whole. It was better than the sickness that came from cheap liquor or the soul-deep ache of despair. She opened her eyes. The light inside the cabin was pale and soft, the first blush of dawn filtering through the cracks in the log walls and the hole in the roof, striping the dusty air with gentle fingers of gold. The world outside was waking up, and for the first time, she was waking up with it, her senses clear, her mind quiet. Her gaze fell upon Calder. He was already awake, of course. He sat on the floor near the stove, his back to her, a silhouette against the fire's gentle glow. He was hunched over something in his lap, his shoulders curved in intense concentration. The morning light caught the silver threads at his temples and the weary set of his broad back. He looked like a man who had not slept at all, but who was not tired, either. He seemed simply to exist, a part of the morning stillness. She lay perfectly still, breathing softly, watching him. He was a mystery, a man of contradictions. He was hard and silent, his presence radiating a formidable, almost dangerous self-containment. Yet he had hidden her, rescued her, and brought her to this place of fragile safety. He had offered her a choice instead of an order, and warmth instead of judgment. Now, in the quiet light of a new day, he was engaged in some small, meticulous task, his focus absolute. Curiosity warred with her instinct to remain unnoticed. She shifted just enough to see what he was doing. In his hands, he held one of her shoes, the one that had taken the worst of their tumble, its sole half torn away from the upper leather, and he was fixing it. He held the ruined shoe with a surprising delicacy in one large, calloused hand. In the other, he wielded a small, sharp awl from a worn leather roll of tools she now saw beside him on the floor. With slow, precise movements, he pushed the awl through the tough leather, creating a new set of holes alongside the torn ones. Then he would take up a length of waxed sinew and, with a needle he produced from the same kit, begin to stitch the shoe back together. His movements were unhurried, economical, and deeply competent. Each push of the awl, each pull of the sinew, was done with an unwavering patience. Nora watched, mesmerized. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever witnessed. It was more personal than a touch, more profound than a word of comfort. This was an act of pure, practical care. Silas Croft had offered her a life of silks and fine things, a cage gilded with the promise of security. This silent, weary stranger was offering her something far more valuable, a mended shoe, a way to keep walking. Her mind struggled to reconcile this act with everything she knew of the world. Men did things for a reason. They offered a hand only to be in a position to claim the whole arm. Kindness was a currency, spent only when a profitable return was expected. What did this man want from her? The question was a cold knot of fear in her stomach, a bitter taste of old lessons learned too well. She searched his posture for any sign of expectation, any hint of the debt she was surely incurring. She found none. He was simply mending a shoe, as if it were the most natural and necessary thing to do in the world, like breathing or tending a fire. He finished a line of stitches and paused, testing the strength of his repair with a firm pull. It held. He seemed satisfied, and in that small moment, Nora saw something else in him. She saw a man who found a quiet purpose in making broken things whole again. Maybe that was all he had left. The world was a chaotic, destructive place, but here, in this small, controllable act, he could impose a moment of order. He could fix what was torn. The patience in his hands was that of a man who had long ago stopped rushing toward any particular future. It was the patience of a man who understood that most things trust, healing. The turning of seasons could not be hurried. It was the patience of a man who no longer held any grand dreams for himself, who no longer believed in promised lands or easy futures. But his actions suggested something else. Too, in mending her shoe, he was not just fixing an object. He was tending to her hope. He was ensuring that her journey, her flight toward a life she could choose for herself, would not be ended by something as simple as a broken shoe. He might not believe in his own destination, but he seemed determined not to let her lose sight of hers. A loose floorboard creaked under her as she shifted her weight. The sound was small, but in the profound quiet of the shack, it was as loud as a shout. Calder's hand stilled. He didn't turn around immediately. He remained facing the fire for a long moment, as if giving her time to arrange herself, to gather the scattered pieces of her composure. When he finally did turn his head, his pale blue eyes met hers across the space. His expression was as neutral and unreadable as the desert landscape outside. There was no greeting, no question in his eyes. He simply looked at her, acknowledging her return to the waking world. "Morning," she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. He gave a single, curt nod in response. He then turned his attention back to her shoe, drawing the final stitches tight and knotting the sinew with a series of deft, strong pulls. He examined his work one last time, then held the shoe out to her. She pushed herself to a sitting position and took it from him. The leather was sturdy and stiff from the repair, and still faintly warm from the heat of his hands. The stitches were not neat or pretty. They were thick, pragmatic, and incredibly strong. The shoe was no longer broken. It was scarred, but it was whole. She ran her thumb over the rough thread, an overwhelming wave of gratitude washing over her. So powerful, it left her breathless. It was a feeling so pure and unfamiliar that she didn't know what to do with it. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. He gave another one of his slight nods and turned away, dismissing her thanks as if it were unnecessary. He began to pack his small toolkit away. Each item returned to its proper place in the leather roll. The intimacy of the moment was over. He was already rebuilding the quiet distance between them. He stood, his tall frame seeming to fill the small shack, and went to the door. He pushed it open, and the bright, clean light of the morning flooded in, making Nora squint. He stood there for a long time, just looking out. He was watching the sun climb over the distant mesas, reading the sky, assessing the day. He was a scout again, surveying the territory, planning their next move. Nora pulled on her mended shoe. It fit snugly, the repair strong and secure against her foot. She stood up, feeling the solid ground beneath her. She was bruised and sore, dressed in torn and dirty clothes, with no possessions to her name and no destination in mind. She was a runaway, a fugitive with powerful men looking for her, by any rational measure. Her situation was as hopeless as it had been the day before. But as she stood there in a shaft of morning sunlight, watching the silent man in the doorway, she did not feel hopeless. She felt the sturdy leather of the repaired shoe around her foot. She felt the lingering warmth from the fire on her skin. She remembered the startling, cleansing flare of burning whiskey, and she felt the weight of a new, fragile knowledge that kindness could exist without a price tag, that a person could be touched with gentleness and without fear. She looked at Calder's back, at the solitary, self-contained set of his shoulders. He was still a stranger, a man walled off by a silence she couldn't penetrate, and she was still afraid. But her fear was different now. It was no longer the all-consuming panic of a cornered animal. It was the clear-eyed fear of a survivor, alert and aware, but ready to take the next step, and the next. For as long as her shoes would hold, they traveled north for 2 days, moving with the sun at their backs in the morning and on their left in the afternoon. Calder set a slow, steady pace, one that conserved energy and allowed his scout's eyes to constantly scan the vast, empty horizon. He moved through the landscape not as a conqueror, but as a ghost, leaving as little trace as possible. Nora followed in his footsteps, learning the rhythm of his silence, the language of his watchfulness. He taught her, through action rather than words, how to find water, how to read the signs of the land, and how to be comfortable with the profound, soul-bearing quiet of the desert. On the evening of the second day, they found a river. It was a thin green ribbon of life carving its way through the red rock and sand, its banks lined with cottonwood trees whose leaves rustled in the evening breeze. After the stark, sun-beaten plains, the sight and sound of moving water felt like a miracle. It promised life, coolness, and a place to wash away the trail dust. They made camp in a small, sheltered clearing a dozen yards from the water's edge. The routine was already becoming familiar. Calder gathered wood for a fire with an efficient, practiced ease, while Nora, following his unspoken lead, took their 2 tin cups and went to the river. She knelt on the damp earth, the cool water a balm on her scraped hands. She watched the current, a steady, relentless flow, and it reminded her of the train, of the feeling of being carried along by a force she could not control. But this was different. The river was not taking her to a cage. It was simply moving, simply being. For the first time, she felt a sense of stillness settle within her. When she returned, Calder had a small fire going, the flames bright and smokeless. He was cleaning 2 rabbits he must have snared along the way, his movements quick and precise. He worked with a hunter's lack of sentimentality, but also with a deep, practical respect for the animal that would be their meal. He handed her a portion of the meat to cook on a sharpened stick, and they sat by the fire as the sky deepened from violet to a dark, star-splashed indigo. They ate in their usual silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the gentle murmur of the river, and the distant call of a night bird. The quiet was no longer a heavy, awkward thing. It had become a space they shared, a common ground where words were not always necessary. But tonight, the silence was different for Nora. It was not empty. It was full of memories, stirred to the surface by the fragile sense of peace she felt by the water. She looked at the man across the fire from her. In the flickering light, his face was a mask of shadows and plains. He asked nothing of her. He had not, in 2 full days, asked who she was, where she came from, or who was chasing her. He had simply accepted her presence, providing for her protection and her needs as a simple matter of fact. This absolute lack of curiosity was the key. It did not pry at her defenses. It allowed them, for the first time, to begin to crumble on their own. "My father was a miner," she said, her voice quiet, tentative. It sounded strange in the vast stillness, but not unwelcome. Calder didn't look up from the stick he was turning over the flames, but she knew he was listening. His stillness was a form of attention more intense than any direct gaze. "In the Colorado mountains?" she continued, the memories coming easier now that the first words were spoken. "He was a good man. He smelled of rock dust and blasting powder and cheap coffee. He used to sing off-key when he thought no one was listening." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "He used to call me his little songbird, said my voice was the only gold he needed." She paused, staring into the flames. "There was a cave-in. A support beam snapped. They said it was quick. I was 14. We lost the claim, the cabin, everything. My mother had passed years before. I had no one but a distant cousin of my father's in a town down on the New Mexico line." This was the part of the story she usually drank to forget, the part where the world broke. She took a breath, the cool night air steadying her. "My cousin. He took me in, for a while. But he was a man with debts and a weak will. He said he found a place for me to work, to earn my keep. He said it was a respectable job, serving drinks in the main saloon. He signed a paper, an indenture. He called it, to the owner, to Mr. Silas Croft." She said the name, and a shiver ran through her despite the fire's warmth. Calder looked up then, his pale eyes meeting hers across the fire. He had heard the name before. On the train. He just nodded, his expression giving nothing away, letting her continue. "It wasn't respectable," she said, her voice flat. "It was a place where men came to forget their lives, and they expected the girls who worked there to help them do it. I learned fast. I learned to smile when I wanted to scream. I learned to laugh at jokes that weren't funny. I learned that my name wasn't Nora anymore. It was whatever the man with $1 in his hand wanted it to be. Every night, I had to pour drinks and listen to their stories and fend off their hands. The noise, it never stopped. The piano, the shouting, the breaking glass, it got inside my head." She looked down at her own hands, twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. "The first time the manager forced a glass of whiskey into my hand, I hated it. It burned. But then, the noise in my head got quieter. My smile felt less like a lie. The men's faces blurred. It was easier. It became a tool, a shield. Before long, I couldn't face the evenings without it. I couldn't sleep without it. It was the only way to get through the night without breaking." She fell silent, lost in the memory of the haze, the suffocating scent of stale beer and cheap perfume, the nightly ritual of drinking just enough to endure, but not so much that she couldn't work. "Then Mr. Croft started paying more attention to me," she went on, her voice barely a whisper. "He was an important man, a town official. He owned half the territory. It seemed he saw everything as a transaction. He started talking about my indenture. about how I was a girl of better quality than the others. He said he could take me out of there. He offered me a new life. He would tear up my contract. He said he would give me a fine house, dresses, respectability. She looked at Calder, her eyes wide and haunted in the firelight. He wanted to marry me. He never asked. He informed me it was just another deal he was making. He was buying a wife, the same way he'd buy a horse or a parcel of land. My cousin thought it was a miracle, my salvation. All I saw was a bigger, quieter cage. The saloon was loud and ugly, but at least there were other people. In his house, it would just be me and him, forever. The story hung in the air between them, stark and ugly. The murmur of the river seemed to grow louder, as if trying to wash the words away. So I ran, she finished simply. She finally looked away from him, back to the fire, a profound sense of shame washing over her. She had laid the whole pathetic story of her life at his feet. She felt exposed, judged. Being sober is terrifying, she admitted, the words coming out in a choked rush. Because when the world is quiet, I can hear myself. I can hear the girl who learned to smile when she was crying inside. I can hear the lies she told, the things she had to do to survive. I don't know who she is. I don't know if the songbird my father knew is even in there anymore. It's easier not to listen. She wrapped her arms around her knees, making herself small, expecting him to turn away, to retreat back into his impenetrable silence, the weight of her past too much for a stranger to bear. Calder was quiet for a long time. He slowly, deliberately, put another piece of wood on the fire, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up into the night. He watched them rise and disappear into the infinite darkness above. He had seen the world. He had seen war and what it did to men. He had seen desperation and the ugly choices it bred. Nothing she said was shocking to him. It was just another sad, hard story from a sad, hard world. But it was her story. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, stripped of pity or judgment. It was the voice of a man stating a fundamental truth, a law of this new territory she had entered. "Here," he said, and he looked at her then, his gaze clear and direct in the firelight. "You're allowed not to forget." He let the words settle, giving them weight. "You're not allowed to run." It was not a command. It was a permit, an offer of sanctuary, not from the world, but from the need to escape herself. He was not telling her that her memories weren't ugly, or that her shame wasn't real. He was telling her that here, in this small circle of firelight, by this quiet river, she didn't have to use whiskey or anything else to hide from them. She could let them be. She could sit with the ghosts of her past, and she would not be alone. Nora looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. He wasn't just a quiet protector. He was a man who understood the landscape of survival, both outside and in. He knew what it was to carry a past that could not be shed. He was not offering her a future, not promising that things would be better. He was offering her the present, a single, sober moment where she was allowed to be exactly who she was, a girl who had been broken, who had survived, and who was, for the first time, learning what it meant not to run. A tear she hadn't realized was forming slipped down her cheek and fell onto the dusty ground. It wasn't a tear of sadness or shame. It was a tear of profound, aching relief. The quiet returned, but it was a different quiet now, filled not with things unsaid, but with a truth finally spoken and accepted, and by the gentle light of the fire, under the vast, watchful sky. Nora felt the first, fragile seed of a hope that the songbird might not be gone forever, but had only been waiting for a safe place to find her voice again. The night she told him her story, something shifted between them. The silence that followed was not the absence of words, but a space filled with a new, sober understanding. They had crossed a threshold, and the journey north that began the next morning felt different. The landscape was the same, a vast, unforgiving expanse of rock and sun, but Nora's perception of it, and of the man who walked ahead of her, had changed. Their life simplified to the raw, essential elements of survival. They walked, they found water, they ate, they slept. Each day was a mirror of the one before, a rhythm dictated by the sun and the terrain. It was a life stripped of all pretense, and in its darkness, Nora began to learn a new language, the silent vocabulary of Calder's actions. Their provisions were meager. Calder had a small sack of hardtack biscuits, dried jerky, and a little coffee. It was a scout's larder, meant for one man traveling light and fast. Now, it had to sustain two. Nora, who had once lived on scraps and charity, felt a pang of guilt with every bite she took, but Calder never made her feel like a burden. When he divided the food, his movements were matter-of-fact, almost clinical. Yet, she began to notice a pattern. Her piece of jerky was always slightly thicker. His hardtack biscuit might have a corner chipped off while hers was whole. The differences were minuscule, easily denied if she were to point them out, but they were consistent. One evening, after a long day's walk that had left her dizzy with exhaustion, he snared another rabbit as he cooked it over their small, carefully concealed fire. The smell of the roasting meat was almost intoxicating. When it was done, he divided it onto their tin plates. He handed her a portion that was clearly the better half, the tender legs and loin, while he took the leaner, bonier sections for himself. She opened her mouth to protest, to say it wasn't fair, but the look on his face stopped her. It wasn't a look of kindness or charity. It was a look of simple, irrefutable fact. He was stronger. He needed less. Her survival was the priority. To argue would be to question his judgment, to disrupt the silent logic that governed their world. So she ate. And the food was more than just sustenance. It was a taste of a kind of care she had never known, a nourishment that went deeper than her empty stomach. She learned to read his stillness. He was a man who seemed to be in a constant state of listening, not just with his ears, but with his entire body. When they stopped to rest, he never simply sat. He would choose a spot with his back to a rock or a cliff face, a position that gave him a clear view of their surroundings. He would seem to be resting, his eyes half closed, but Nora noticed that his gaze was always moving, sweeping the horizon in slow, methodical arcs. He was watching for the glint of sun on a rifle barrel, for the unnatural dust cloud of approaching riders, for any sign that the world of men was catching up to them. His hands were a constant source of fascination for her. They were large, scarred, and weathered, the hands of a man who had lived his life outdoors. Yet they were capable of surprising dexterity. One afternoon, while they rested in the sparse shade of a juniper tree, he worked on a piece of his horse tack he'd salvaged a frayed leather rein. Nora watched as he held the rein steady with his right hand, close to his body, while he did the intricate work of cutting and weaving a patch with his left. It was an awkward, inefficient way to work. Any other man would have reversed his hands. She almost asked him why, but then she understood. His right hand, his gun hand, was never fully occupied. It was always free, always resting in a way that it could move in a fraction of a second to the worn grip of the pistol at his hip or the knife sheathed on his belt. It was a habit so deeply ingrained that he was likely unaware of it. He lived in a state of permanent readiness. He was a shield, and he never, for a single moment, set that shield down. The realization sent a shiver through her, but it was not a shiver of fear. It was a profound sense of security. His watchfulness was not just for himself. It was for her, too. The nights were the hardest and the most telling. The desert air grew bitingly cold as soon as the sun vanished. The first night after the river, when the reality of their journey truly set in. He had laid out his single bedroll and his heavy duster on the ground. She had expected to sleep separately, to huddle alone in her own thin coat. Instead, he simply gestured to the makeshift bed. "The ground pulls the heat from you," he stated, his voice flat. "We share the warmth or we freeze." It was a matter of logistics, not intimacy. There was no room for modesty in the face of survival. Hesitantly, She lay down on the rough wool of the bedroll, and he lay down beside her, on top of the blanket, pulling his heavy leather duster over both of them. It was a strange and terrifying moment for her. For years, the proximity of a man in the darkness had meant danger, a prelude to something she had to endure. She lay ramrod straight, every muscle tensed, waiting for a hand to move, for a shift in his breathing. But his breathing remained slow and steady. He lay on his back, his hands folded on his chest, a clear foot of space between their bodies. He was as still as the rocks around them. He took the outside position, his body a physical barrier between her and the vast, dark wilderness. The heavy duster was a shared roof, trapping their combined body heat in a small, precious pocket of warmth. Slowly, minute by painful minute, the tension seeped out of her. He was not a threat. He was a furnace, a wall. He offered warmth and protection, and he asked for nothing in return. Under that shared covering, night after night, Nora learned the true meaning of trust. It wasn't something you gave in a single leap of faith. It was something you learned, breath by sober breath, in the cold, honest dark. She began to sleep deeply, a true, restorative sleep, feeling safer under a blanket of stars with this silent stranger than she had ever felt behind the locked doors of the saloon. She started to anticipate their needs, to become a partner rather than a ward. She learned to find the driest wood, to pack the bedroll in the tight, efficient way he did, to spot the subtle green of a plant that signaled underground water. One morning, as Calder was scouting a path up a rocky incline, she noticed one of the straps on his saddlebag was about to give way. Without thinking, she took out the awl and sinew he had used on her shoe and began to mend it. The stitches were clumsy and uneven, a pale imitation of his own neat work, but they were strong. When he returned, he saw her finishing her task. He stopped and looked at the mended strap, then at her face, her brow furrowed in concentration. He didn't say thank you. He didn't praise her work. He simply took the bag, tested the strength of her repair with a firm tug, and gave a single, satisfied nod. For Nora, that silent nod was more rewarding than a string of pretty compliments. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. It meant she was no longer just the person he was protecting. She was part of the reason they were both surviving. Their journey became a silent dance of shared existence. They shared hard bread and cold water from a stream. They shared the warmth of a single blanket against the biting night. They shared long days of walking without a single word passing between them. But in the quiet spaces, a powerful bond was being forged. Nora learned to trust in the unwavering evidence of his actions. She saw it in the way he always took the first sip from a newly discovered spring. A quick, small taste to ensure it was safe before he let her drink. She saw it in the way he would wake in the middle of the night, not with a start, but with a slow, silent rise to check the perimeter of their camp before settling back down. He was a man of ghosts and deep sorrows. She could feel it in the profound weariness that sometimes settled in his eyes when he stared into the fire. And she was a girl with a past that had left her scarred and afraid. They were two broken people, walking north toward an unknown future. But out here, under the vast, indifferent sky, their shared burdens seemed lighter. The trail dust settled on their clothes and in their hair, a constant reminder of their hard-won progress. And every evening, when they stopped to make camp, they would share a cup of water, a small meal, and a silence that was no longer empty, but full of the deep, unspoken truth of mutual reliance and a trust that was as real and as solid as the ground beneath their feet. They had been walking for nearly a week when the character of the land began to change. The stark, red rock desert with its sparse, thorny vegetation gradually softened. The ground grew firmer, the air cooler. They entered a high country of rolling hills dotted with pinon pine and juniper, and soon they were in a forest of aspen trees, their white trunks like silent sentinels, their leaves shimmering gold in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles, a rich, living scent that was a balm to Nora's dust-weary senses. Nora noticed a change in Calder as well. The constant, sweeping vigilance in his eyes lessened, replaced by a focused, forward-looking gaze. He walked with a new purpose, a familiarity in his stride, as if his boots recognized the feel of the ground beneath them. He was no longer just moving north, he was heading somewhere. He had a destination. The sound reached them first, a low, constant murmur that grew steadily louder until it became the clear, musical rush of running water. They crested a small rise, and there it was, a narrow valley, sheltered on three sides by pine-covered slopes. A stream, clear and fast, tumbled over smooth gray stones, its banks thick with willows and green grass. It was a pocket of impossible life and beauty hidden away in the vast, harsh territory. And nestled in a grove of cottonwoods near the stream sat a cabin. It was not a ruin like the shack where they had first taken shelter. This place had been built to last. It was small, made of sturdy, expertly fitted logs, the chinking between them still mostly intact. A stone chimney, straight and solid, rose from one end. The wood of the walls had been bleached by sun and scoured by wind to a soft, silvery gray. A porch ran the length of the front, its roof sagging slightly but holding firm. It was a place of deep, profound quiet, a structure that seemed to have grown from the earth rather than been forced upon it. It had the look of a place that had been loved, and then, for a very long time, forgotten. It was waiting. Calder stopped at the edge of the clearing, his boots planted in the pine needles. He stood for a long time, just looking at it. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften, the permanent tension in his shoulders easing. He was not just looking at a building. He was looking at a memory. Nora stood beside him, silent, sensing the sacredness of the moment. She felt like an intruder on a private pilgrimage. "I was 17 when we built this," he said, his voice low and rough, directed not at her but at the cabin itself. "My brother, Ethan, he was 15. We thought we were men, thought we'd found paradise." He took a slow breath, the sound of it lost in the rustle of the aspen leaves. It was the first time he had ever volunteered a piece of his past, the first time he had mentioned a name, Ethan. The name hung in the clean mountain air, a ghost given substance. "My father had passed, and we'd had enough of scratching for wages on other men's ranches. We headed west, found this valley. No one had claimed it. The water runs all year, good timber. We thought we'd build a life here, raise some cattle. Maybe." He gestured with his chin toward the cabin. Ethan was the one with the knack for it. He could notch a log so clean it looked like it was born to fit. "I just did the heavy lifting. We spent a whole summer on it, lived on fish from that stream and whatever we could shoot." He fell silent again, his eyes tracing the lines of the roof, the frame of the single window. Nora could almost see them. Two young men, brothers, full of sweat and hope, their hammers and saws echoing in the quiet valley as they built not just a shelter, but a future. "He was a good kid," Calder continued, his voice softer now, flatter. "Too good for this country, maybe. He saw the world different than I did. He'd spend an hour watching an eagle circle just for the beauty of it. Me, I'd just be wondering if it had spotted a rabbit we could eat." A faint, sad shadow of a smile touched his lips for a fraction of a second, then vanished. "We finished it just before the first snow. We were so proud. Sat on that porch the first night, thought we were kings of the whole damn world." He looked away from the cabin then, his gaze turning to a small, cleared patch of ground a little ways off, marked by a simple, weathered wooden cross. "The fever took him that winter," Calder said, the word stripped of all emotion, a simple statement of a brutal fact. "Came on fast. There was no doctor, nothing I could do. He burned up in 3 days. I buried him out there, by the stream, where he liked to watch the fish." He stared at the small, lonely cross, and in his silence, Nora could feel the weight of that long, terrible winter, of a 17-year-old boy alone in a paradise that had become a prison. The echoes of his brother's last breaths, trapped within the sturdy walls they had built together. The cabin was not just a memory of hope. It was a monument to loss. "I stayed till the spring thaw," he said, turning his gaze back to the empty porch. "Couldn't stand the quiet anymore. Boarded it up and walked away. Joined the army as a scout not long after. Never looked back. Never thought I would." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were not the flat, empty blue she was used to. They were deep, and they held the sorrow of a decade. He had not just brought her to a shelter. He had brought her to the grave of his brother, to the tomb of his own youth. He reached into the worn inner pocket of his duster, the one she had once hidden inside. His fingers fumbled for a moment before closing around a small, hard object. He pulled his hand out and opened it. Lying in his palm was a key. It was made of heavy, dark iron, the intricate head shaped like a clover, the shaft and bit coated in a fine layer of rust. It was an old key, a key that belonged to a real lock, not just a simple latch. He held it out to her. Nora just stared at it, at the contrast between the rusty, forgotten object and the living warmth of his calloused palm. "If you want," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you can stay here." The offer was so simple, so direct, it stole the air from her lungs. Stay here. The words were a lifeline. It was not a demand or a proposition. It was a choice. Her choice. A place to stop running. A place to be. She didn't move, her mind reeling. He had brought her to the most sacred, painful place he knew, and he was offering it to her. He pushed the key a little closer to her hand. "A key," he said, his voice quiet but intense, each word carefully chosen, "is for the last person you trust." The meaning behind his words was a physical blow. Trust. He was giving her the key to the last piece of his heart that wasn't hardened or dead. He was trusting her with the memory of his brother, with the ghost of his own lost hope. He was trusting her to bring life back to this place of silence and sorrow. It was a burden and a gift of such magnitude that it left her speechless. Her hand, trembling slightly, rose to meet his. Her fingers brushed against his, and she took the key. It was heavy in her palm, its rusted surface cool and solid. It felt more real than anything she had ever held. It was the key to a door, to a life, to the first real choice she had ever been given. She looked from the key in her hand to his face. Her throat was tight, her heart hammering against her ribs. There were no words for what she felt. "Thank you," was a pale, flimsy phrase, utterly inadequate for the gravity of this moment. Any words she could offer would be a desecration of the profound, silent language they had built between them on the trail. So she said nothing. She simply held his gaze for a long, timeless moment. In her eyes, he could see her answer. He could see the awe, the fear, and the fierce dawning flicker of a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She understood the weight of what he was offering, and she was not turning away from it. She closed her fingers around the key, her fist tightening on the solid iron promise. Then, she turned from him and walked across the clearing. Her mended shoes made soft sounds on the pine needles. She stepped onto the porch, the old boards groaning a welcome under her weight. The front door was made of thick, heavy planks, with a large, ornate iron lock set into it. She slid the rusty key into the lock. It resisted for a moment, then turned with a loud, grating click that echoed in the quiet valley the sound of a long dormant heart being unlocked. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cool and musty, thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and time. A single room, larger than she expected. A wide stone hearth dominated one wall. A sturdy table and 2 chairs sat in the center of the room. A sleeping bunk was built into the far wall. Dust lay like a soft gray blanket over everything. Sunlight streamed through the dirty window pane, illuminating a million dancing motes of dust. It was a place frozen in time, waiting. Nora walked slowly to the far side of the room, where a small counter stood with a dry sink basin set into it, a hand pump beside it for drawing water from the stream. Her fingers traced the edge of the wooden counter, leaving a clean line in the thick dust. She looked around the quiet waiting room. This was it, a place to stop, a place to be sober, a place to remember, and a place to begin. She did not weep. She did not celebrate. She acted with a deep, steadying breath. She picked up a discarded rag from the corner. She took it to the dry sink and began to methodically, deliberately, wipe away the decade of dust from the basin. Her movements were simple, practical, and filled with a profound sense of purpose. It was the first act of a new life, an answer given not in words, but in work, an acceptance, a promise. She was cleaning a home. The days in the valley settled into a rhythm that was as gentle and steady as the stream that flowed through it. Nora learned the cabin's secrets, the floorboard that groaned by the hearth, the way the morning sun hit the window to wake her, the scent of pine that clung to the log walls after a rain. She spent her hours in a flurry of purposeful activity that was a balm to her soul. She scrubbed the floors, patched the chinking with mud and moss, and washed the single set of dusty sheets she found in a trunk until they were clean and smelled of sunshine and river water. She was not just cleaning a space, she was reclaiming a life. Each simple domestic act was a defiance of her past. Calder remained a quiet presence on the periphery. He would disappear for hours at a time, hunting or scouting the ridges of the valley, and would return with a rabbit or a string of fish, which he would leave on the porch without a word. He was giving her the cabin, letting her make it her own. His trust as silent and as solid as the mountains that surrounded them. One afternoon, while cleaning out a small, forgotten cupboard above the bunk, her fingers had brushed against a bottle tucked away in the back. It was half full of amber liquid whiskey, left behind by Ethan, perhaps, a relic of the life that had been. Her first instinct had been a jolt of something like fear or recognition. It was like finding a venomous snake coiled in a dark corner. She had pushed it back into the shadows of the cupboard and tried to forget it was there. A ghost of a temptation she was determined to ignore. In the quiet of the valley, the girl who had needed to stay drunk to survive was slowly, tentatively, disappearing. In her place was a young woman who was learning the sound of her own sober thoughts, and finding that they were not as terrifying as she had feared. The songbird was not dead. She was just quiet, healing her bruised wings. The peace was shattered on a crisp autumn afternoon a few weeks after their arrival. Nora was on the porch, mending one of Calder's shirts with the small sewing kit she had found, when she heard the sound of an approaching horse. It was not Calder's deliberate, ground-eating stride. This was a tired, plodding gait. She looked up and saw a lone figure riding into the clearing. It was a woman, perched atop a sway-backed nag. She was wiry and hard-faced, her skin weathered like old leather, her eyes small and dark like currants. She wore a severe black dress, gray with trail dust. As she drew closer, Nora's heart froze in her chest, the needle slipping from her fingers. The blood drained from her face. She knew this woman. It was Agnes, the cousin-in-law of the man who had taken her in, the woman who had negotiated her indenture to Silas Croft. Agnes reined in her horse and surveyed the cabin, her thin lips pressed into a line of disapproval. Her eyes, devoid of warmth or surprise, finally settled on Nora. "So this is where you got to?" she said, her voice as dry as dust. "Gave everyone quite a turn." Nora stood up slowly, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What are you doing here, Agnes?" "Business," the older woman said, dismounting with a weary grunt. "Mr. Croft was displeased. Put a bounty out. But I told him I'd find you myself. It's a family matter, after all." She did not sound concerned. She sounded annoyed, as if Nora's escape was a clerical error that she had been forced to correct. At that moment, Calder emerged from the tree line, silent as a shadow. He held a brace of rabbits in one hand. He took in the scene, the strange horse, the hard-faced woman. The terror on Nora's face and his expression became one of absolute, cold stillness. He did not reach for his gun. He didn't have to. His presence was enough to make the air crackle. Agnes's eyes flickered toward him, and, for the first time, a hint of unease crossed her face. "This your new protector?" she asked Nora, a sneer in her voice. "What do you want?" Nora repeated, her voice shaking but firm. "What is owed?" Agnes said, turning her attention back to Nora, dismissing Calder as if he were a part of the landscape. "You broke a contract, girl. Mr. Croft has rescinded his offer of marriage. Of course, but the indenture is still valid. He wants his property returned or its value compensated." "I have no money," Nora said, her throat tight. "I know that," Agnes snapped. "But the papers have value. Another buyer has expressed interest. But I can't sell the contract without the name. The name on the papers is Eleanor Vance. That's the legal entity. You, going by Nora, have no right to it. I'm here to take it back." Nora stared at her, uncomprehending. "Take back my name." "It's not your name. It's the name on a legal document that belongs to me, as your guardian," Agnes said with cold, impeccable logic. "You sign a paper relinquishing all claim to the name of Eleanor Vance, and I will sign a paper saying the indenture is broken, and you are free. We go our separate ways. It's a clean transaction." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. It was not a physical violence, but a psychological one. Agnes was not just trying to settle a debt. She was trying to erase her. Eleanor Vance was the name on her birth certificate, but Nora was the name her father had called her. It was the last piece of him, the last piece of herself, that she had clung to in the darkness of the saloon. To give it up would be to admit that she was no one, a nameless thing with no past and no claim to a future. "No," Nora whispered. "Don't be a fool," Agnes hissed. "You think you can hide here forever with this mountain man. The world is bigger than this valley. Sooner or later, you'll need a name, and you won't have one. You'll be a ghost. Sign the paper. It's the only way to be truly free of Mr. Croft." It was a devil's bargain. She could be free of her contract, but only at the cost of her own identity. The fragile piece of the last few weeks shattered into a million pieces. She was not Nora, the girl who was healing. She was Eleanor Vance, a name on a piece of paper, a piece of property to be bought and sold. Calder took a single, silent step forward. Agnes flinched, her hand flying to her throat. He said nothing. He just looked at her, and his eyes were like chips of winter ice. The message was clear. Her business here was concluded. Agnes seemed to shrink under his gaze. She fumbled in her saddlebag and pulled out a folded piece of paper and a pencil. She threw them onto the porch floor. "I'll be in the nearest town for 2 days. She spat. "Bring me the paper, signed, and we are done. If not, I'm turning your location over to Croft's men. Let them sort it out." Without another word, she heaved herself back onto her horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a poisoned silence in her wake. Nora stood staring at the paper on the floor as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. The world seemed to tilt and sway around her. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was just a temporary hiding place. The quiet of the valley was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of a tomb. The name her father gave her, the last thread connecting her to the person she was meant to be, was being held for ransom. She heard Calder's soft footfalls on the porch, but she didn't look at him. She couldn't. She felt a familiar, desperate craving rise up in her throat, a frantic need for the world to stop, for the noise in her head to cease. She turned and fled into the cabin, the light from the open door seeming to mock her. Her movements were frantic, desperate. She was a cornered animal seeking its burrow. She scrambled onto the bunk, her hands flying to the small cupboard above it. She clawed at the back, her fingers closing around the cool, smooth glass of the forgotten bottle. She pulled it out. her breath coming in ragged sobs. Whiskey, oblivion, the shield. She slid to the floor, her back against the rough log wall, and fumbled with the cork. It came free with a soft pop. The sharp, medicinal scent of the liquor filled the air, a smell that was both repulsive and deeply, desperately familiar. It promised numbness. It promised a quiet, dark place where Agnes's words and Silas Croft's shadow couldn't reach her. She lifted the bottle, her hand shaking so violently that the amber liquid sloshed against the glass. This was it. This was the only escape. To be sober now, to feel the full weight of this despair, was more than she could bear. A shadow fell over her. Calder was standing in the doorway, the brace of rabbits still in his hand. He had watched her flee, had seen the frantic purpose in her movements. He said nothing. He slowly, deliberately, set the rabbits down outside the door and then came inside, his tall frame filling the small space. He did not yell, he did not lecture, he did not try to reason with her. He simply walked over and sat down on the floor beside her. He didn't sit too close, leaving a respectful space between them. But his presence was a solid, undeniable fact. It was a wall of quiet strength against her swirling chaos. She clutched the bottle to her chest, her knuckles white. She expected him to try and take it from her. She was ready for a fight, for a struggle. But he just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the dusty floorboards in front of them. He sat with her in her despair, in her temptation. And he did not judge. He simply shared the silence with her. The minutes stretched on, thick and heavy. The only sounds were her own ragged breathing and the gentle sigh of the wind outside. Finally, when the tension in her arms was an unbearable ache, he spoke. His voice was incredibly soft, a low murmur that barely disturbed the air. "I want you to remember tonight," he said. His words were so unexpected they cut through the fog of her panic. She looked at him, her eyes blurry with unshed tears. He slowly, gently, reached out his hand, not to snatch the bottle, but with his palm open, an invitation. He looked from the bottle to her eyes. "Not with liquor," he said, his voice steady and calm. "With a choice." He held her gaze, and in the depths of his eyes, she saw not an order, but a plea. He was not forbidding her from drinking. He was asking her to choose not to. He was asking her to face this moment, this ugly, painful, shattering moment, and to remember it, to own it, to choose to feel the pain, because feeling it meant she was still alive, still fighting. To drink was to let Agnes win, to let her erase the Nora who had fought so hard to get here. To stay sober was to claim her own name, her own story, her own pain. Her hand, still clutching the bottle, trembled. The choice was a physical thing, a crushing weight in the center of her chest. Oblivion or memory, escape or existence. With a long, shuddering sob that seemed to tear its way up from the very bottom of her soul, she lowered the bottle. Her fingers loosened. He did not take it from her. He waited, in an act of profound, agonizing surrender. She placed the bottle on the floor between them. She had made her choice. He reached over then, his movement still slow and deliberate, and his fingers closed around the bottle. He did not pour it out. He simply set it aside, out of her reach, a defeated ghost. He had not taken her choice away. He had simply waited for her to make it, and in the terrible, beautiful, sober quiet of the cabin, Nora began to weep, not for the name she might lose, but for the self she had just refused to abandon. The morning after Agnes's visit, the cabin was filled with a quiet that was different from all the silences that had come before. It was not the peace of sanctuary, nor the tense watchfulness of the trail. It was the heavy, fragile stillness that follows a storm. When the air is clean and the world feels both broken and new. The whiskey bottle sat on the high shelf where Calder had placed it, a dark, silent monument to a choice made in the depths of despair. It was no longer a temptation or a threat. It was simply a fact, a part of the cabin's history, a story of a battle fought and won in the dark. Nora woke with the first light, her body aching with the ghost of yesterday's tension, but her mind was strangely, fiercely clear. The tears she had shed had washed away the panic, leaving behind a raw, resolute calm. She looked at Calder, who was asleep for once, sitting propped against the wall near the cold hearth, his duster wrapped around him. Even in sleep, he looked like a guardian, a rugged mountain watching over a fragile valley. She felt a surge of something so powerful and so unfamiliar it had no name. It was a feeling of gratitude so profound it was almost painful, woven through with a fierce, protective tenderness. He had not saved her from her past. He had sat with her in the darkness and trusted her to save herself. She rose quietly, careful not to wake him. She stoked the embers in the stove, adding small pieces of kindling until a steady flame was born. The cabin needed warmth, needed life. As she moved about the small space, her eyes fell upon Calder's saddlebags, which he had left by the door. In one of them, she knew, was a small, cloth-wrapped parcel of flour, a luxury he had likely been saving. An idea began to form in her mind, a memory rising from a deep, long-forgotten place. It was the memory of her mother's hands, pale and slender, dusted with white flour. The memory of a warm kitchen that smelled of yeast and melting butter. The memory of a recipe, not written down, but known by heart. A legacy passed on in movements and scents. Her mother had called them survival biscuits. A simple, hearty bread that could be made with the most basic ingredients, but which, when fresh from the oven, tasted like love itself. To bake bread was to create. It was to take dead, inert things, flour, water, salt, and transform them into living sustenance. It was an act of faith. It was an answer to Agnes's attempt to unmake her. It was a way to say, I am here. I have a past that is more than just a name on a contract, and I can still make something good. With a new sense of purpose, she found the flour, a small stash of salt, and a tin of baking powder. She mixed them in a wooden bowl, her movements hesitant at first, then more confident as the muscle memory returned. She added water from the stream, her hands plunging into the cool, sticky mixture. She turned the dough out onto the rough wooden table and began to knead. It was hard work. She pushed the dough away with the heels of her hands and folded it back on itself, again and again. With every push, every fold, she worked the tension from her own body. She kneaded out the fear of Silas Croft, the shame of the saloon, the cold poison of Agnes's words. She kneaded in the memory of her father's off-key singing, the warmth of the fire in the shack, the solid weight of the iron key in her palm. The dough came alive under her hands, transforming from a shaggy, ragged mess into a smooth, elastic sphere that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Calder woke to the smell. It was a scent so alien to his world of wood smoke, leather, and blood that it took him a moment to place it. It was the warm, sweet, wholesome smell of baking bread. It was the smell of a home. He opened his eyes and saw Nora standing by the stove, her back to him, her face lit by the glow from the open oven door. Her hair was messy. A smudge of flour was on her cheek, and she looked more beautiful than any woman he had ever seen. He didn't speak. He watched as she took a knife and carefully scored the top of the loaf before sliding it into the small, hot oven. He saw the concentration on her face, the quiet, focused grace in her movements. This was not the terrified girl from the train, nor the haunted woman from the night before. This was someone new, someone who was building a life from the inside out. He understood what she was doing. She was filling the cabin with a new memory, a scent that would banish the ghosts of dust and disuse forever. He rose and pulled on his boots. As she closed the oven door, he started his own work. He took a small, sharp axe and his knife and went outside into the crisp morning air. He walked to a grove of aspens that had been felled by a long-ago wind, their wood seasoned and silvered by the years. He selected a thick, straight branch its surface smooth and pale. He was a man who thought in terms of practicalities, of needs, and he had recognized a need. Their coats, their bedrolls, their few possessions, they were piled in a corner, a constant reminder of the transient life of the trail. A home needed a place to hang things. He began to work, his movements as patient and precise as hers had been with the doe. He stripped the bark from the branch with his knife, revealing the clean, white wood beneath. He carved pegs from smaller branches, carefully whittling one end of each to a point and notching the other so it would fit snugly into a hole. He worked in silence, the only sounds the scrape of his knife and the whisper of the wind in the pines. His hands, which could track an enemy, skin a deer, or draw a pistol in a blur of motion, were now engaged in an act of domestic creation. He was not building a defense, he was building a convenience. And in that simple, practical object, there was a profound statement of permanence. A coat rack was for people who intended to stay. Inside, the cabin filled with the incredible, heart-swelling aroma of the baking bread. Nora felt a sense of peace settle over her that was as real and as warm as the heat from the stove. When the loaf was done, she pulled it from the oven. Its crust a perfect, burnished gold. She set it on the table to cool. A humble offering, a declaration of life. Calder came back inside, carrying the finished rack. It was simple, rustic, and beautiful. He had drilled holes in the main branch and fitted the pegs into them, creating a sturdy, elegant piece from nothing but deadfall and time. Without a word, he mounted it on the wall next to the door. He took his heavy duster and hung it on one of the pegs. Then he looked at Nora. She understood. She took her own thin coat and hung it beside his. They hung there together. Two different shapes, two different histories, sharing the same space. They ate the bread for their midday meal. Sitting at the rough table, they ate it with a piece of smoked fish Calder had caught. The bread was dense and hearty, and it was the best thing Nora had ever tasted. They didn't speak of Agnes. They didn't speak of the papers she had left behind, which Nora had quietly burned in the stove that morning. They didn't speak of the future. They just shared the bread, and in the simple, profound act of eating what she had made, a new kind of covenant was sealed between them. Later that afternoon, while Calder was outside splitting firewood, Nora felt a new impulse. She went to the small bundle that contained her only possessions. From it, she took a small, linen handkerchief. It was old and soft from many washings, and in one corner was a clumsily embroidered N, stitched by her own hand when she was a little girl. It was the only thing she had left that both her mother and father had touched. It was a tangible piece of her own, true name. She went to the single, grimy window of the cabin. She had cleaned the glass, but it was still a stark, empty square. She took the handkerchief, folded it into a triangle, and tucked one corner into the top of the window frame, letting it hang down like a small, simple curtain. It was a tiny thing, a splash of white against the gray logs, but it transformed the space. It softened the harsh light. It was a touch of grace, a claim of ownership. It was her flag, planted firmly in the soil of her new life. It was a quiet declaration that this was not just a shelter. It was a home, and a woman lived here. When Calder came back to the cabin with an armload of wood, he stopped in the doorway. He saw the handkerchief in the window. He saw the way it caught the afternoon light, the way it moved in the slight draft from the door. He looked at it for a long time. Then his gaze shifted to Nora, who was watching him, her heart in her throat. He didn't smile, but the hard lines around his eyes softened. He gave a single, slow nod of understanding. He saw what she had done. He saw the flag she had planted, and he gave her his answer. He set the wood down and walked past the cabin, toward the small, fallow patch of earth that had once, perhaps, been a garden. The ground was hard, choked with weeds and rocks. He took up a pickaxe that had been left leaning against the chimney, its handle smooth from another man's hands, a lifetime ago. The air was growing cold as evening approached, a chill that seeped into a man's bones. He began to work. He swung the pickaxe, the rhythmic, metallic chunk of it breaking the valley's silence. He was not just clearing the ground. He was defining a space. He started digging post holes in a line, marking the boundary of a new beginning. His hands, raw and aching from the cold, worked with a tireless, relentless purpose. He was building a fence. Not a fence to keep things out, but a fence to keep things in. A fence to protect a garden. A fence to enclose a home. Nora stood on the porch, wrapped in her coat, and watched him. He did not say, "Stay." He did not say, "I love you." He did not say, "This is our home." He just swung the pickaxe, his breath pluming in the cold air, his body a dark, strong silhouette against the setting sun. He was building a fence around her heart, a sanctuary made of his own sweat and resolve. And in the growing twilight, with the scent of fresh bread still lingering in the air and a small white handkerchief fluttering in the window, the cabin was no longer a place of ghosts and sorrows. It was a promise, taking root in the hard, cold earth. It was a home, being built one heartbeat, one choice, one swing of an axe at a time. Autumn arrived in the valley not as a sudden event, but as a slow, quiet exhalation. The fierce green of summer softened. The aspens on the high slopes ignited into a trembling blaze of gold, and the air grew sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of coming cold. The stream ran lower and clearer, its boisterous summer song mellowing to a gentle, contemplative murmur. The cabin had become a home. The fence Calder had built now enclosed a small, tidy garden patch, cleared of rocks and turned over for the winter, awaiting the spring. The coat rack he had made held their 2 dusters, hanging side by side like old companions. The small linen handkerchief still fluttered in the window, a soft, white flag of domestic peace. They had settled into a life of shared tasks and comfortable silences, a world contained within the protective embrace of the mountains. Nora found a joy she had never known in the simple, rhythmic work of the days. She learned the feel of an axe handle in her hands, the satisfaction of a cleanly split log. She learned to fish in the stream, her patience rewarded by the flash of a trout in the clear water. She learned the names of the plants that grew in the valley, which ones were for medicine and which were for the cookpot. She was no longer just surviving. She was living, her hands and her mind engaged in the tangible, honest work of building a life. Calder watched her transformation with a quiet, profound satisfaction. The haunted, terrified look in her eyes had been replaced by a clear, steady gaze. The frantic energy of the runaway had settled into a graceful, purposeful competence. She moved about the cabin with an air of ownership, her presence softening its rough, masculine edges. He found himself listening for the sound of her humming as she worked, a low, half-forgotten tune that was the first, tentative return of the songbird. He had not intended to stay. He had thought he would leave her here, in this place of ghosts, and continue his own aimless journey north. But the days had turned into weeks, and the thought of leaving had become a dull, persistent ache in his chest. He was a man who had walked away from everything he had ever built, and now, against all logic, he found himself wanting to stay, to put down roots in the very soil that held his deepest sorrow. Nora was not just cleaning the cabin, she was cleaning the tarnished corners of his own soul, letting light into places he had boarded up for a decade. One evening, after a day spent reinforcing the cabin roof against the coming snows, they sat by the fire. A stew of rabbit and wild roots bubbled in a pot over the flames, filling the small room with a rich, savory aroma. The wind had picked up outside, a lonesome whistle that made the warmth of the hearth feel even more precious. Nora was sewing a patch on the knee of her worn trousers, her head bent in concentration, the firelight catching the gold in her hair. Calder was cleaning his rifle, his movements methodical and sure. A comfortable, domestic silence enveloped them. It was in these moments that Nora felt the change most profoundly. She was not afraid. She was not waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was simply present, sitting in a warm, safe room with a man she trusted. And the quiet was not empty. It was full of peace. Calder finished his work. He oiled the last piece of the rifle mechanism and set it aside. He looked at Nora, at the way the firelight softened the lines of her face, and he made a decision. He rose, his movements as deliberate as always, and went to his saddlebags, which still lay in the corner. He opened one of them and reached deep inside, past the spare ammunition and the dried jerky. His fingers closed around a bottle. He brought it back to the fire and set it on the small, rough-hewn table between them. It was not the bottle from the cupboard. This one was new, the glass clean and dark, the cork sealed with a wrap of red foil. It was a bottle of good whiskey, the kind a man might buy in a real town, a bottle saved for a special occasion or a particularly hard night. It was something he had been carrying for a long time, a private ghost, a last link to a world he had tried to leave behind. Nora's hand stilled in her lap. She looked at the bottle, then at Calder's face. His expression was calm, unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on her. This was not a test, it was a ceremony. He took his knife and, with a flick of his thumb, neatly sliced through the foil seal. He worked the cork free with a soft, sighing pop. He did not reach for a cup. He simply pushed the open bottle across the table toward her. It was an offer, a question, a final acknowledgement of the journey she had made. Nora looked at the bottle. She saw in its dark, reflective surface the ghost of the girl on the train, the girl who would have snatched it up and drunk until the world went away. She saw the girl in the saloon, her hands shaking as she poured another drink to dull the noise in her head. She saw the desperate, cornered animal who had clawed the other bottle from the cupboard, seeking only the mercy of oblivion. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. She reached out and took the bottle. Her hand was steady. The glass felt cool and solid, heavy with a power she now understood. She lifted it, watching the firelight shimmer through the amber liquid. She remembered the burning taste, the false warmth, the blessed, deceptive quiet it offered. She remembered needing it more than she needed air. And then she thought of the things she had gained since she had last tasted it, the true, clean taste of cold stream water, the sharp, honest ache in her muscles after a day of hard work, the brilliant, almost painful gold of the aspen leaves in the morning sun, the sound of Calder's steady breathing beside her in the dark. These were the things sobriety had given her. They were real. They were hers. She had earned them. She held the bottle for a long, silent moment, not in temptation, but in contemplation. She was saying goodbye to the ghost. She was acknowledging its power, and then she was dismissing it. With a slow, deliberate movement, she set the bottle back on the table, a clear space away from her. "Today," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell in the quiet cabin, "I don't need it." A profound stillness settled over the room. The fire crackled. A log shifted, sending a cascade of bright orange sparks up the chimney. Calder looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the walls around his heart crumble completely. A slow, gentle light filled his eyes, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He nodded, a gesture of deep, final acceptance. "Then we'll remember all of it," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. Every word, every touch. It was the most beautiful promise she had ever heard. It was not a promise of an easy future, but of a shared past, a history they would build together, clear-eyed and present. They would not blur the hard edges or the quiet joys. They would own it all. He did not lean across the table to kiss her. There was no sudden, passionate embrace. That was not their language. Instead, he reached his hand across the rough-hewn wood, palm up, an offering of a different kind. She looked at his hand. It was scarred and calloused, a map of a hard life. It was the hand that had pulled her from a train, mended her shoe, built a fence, and sat with her in her darkest moment. It was the strongest, gentlest hand she had ever known. She placed her own hand in his fingers closed around hers, his grip firm and warm. It was not a lover's passionate grasp. It was something deeper, quieter. It was the touch of a partner, a guardian, a friend. It was the touch of a man who had come home. They sat there for a long time as the fire burned low, their hands clasped on the table between them. The new, unopened bottle stood nearby. A silent witness. Outside, the wind sang its lonesome song, but inside the cabin, there was only the warm, profound quiet of two solitary souls who had, against all odds, found each other. The fire burned warm, and memory began sober and true. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please leave a comment below to connect with us and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. If you'd like to support us further, please consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.